Radical means to get down to the roots. This is Rootwork, and I'm Tandasizwe Shimaringa. Despite the facts on the ground, many American news outlets refuse to identify what's happening in Gaza as genocide, citing a lack of evidence for the term. But in fact, the very definition of genocide and the metrics for identifying it under international law require precisely the kind of evidence we're seeing now, which means that any news outlet claiming to produce evidence-based journalism that won't use the word genocide is violating its own stated principles. Through journalistic sleight of hand, including the use of passive language, ever-shifting headlines, both sidesism, and the myth of objectivity, reporters across the U.S. are fueling the genocide their newsrooms are refusing to acknowledge is taking place. That is an excerpt from the latest editorial by Prism Reports. Prism is an independent and nonprofit news outlet led by journalists of color who report from the ground up and at the intersections of injustice. Here with me now to discuss this latest editorial and the work of Prism is Kimberly Rooney, one of the editors at that collective. Kimberly, thank you so much for being on Rootwork today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Kimberly, talking about the myth of objectivity, talking about the need to report the news, talking about so much that we need to talk about. Can you tell us the decision, what was behind the decision of Prism to come out with this editorial statement?
Yeah, so the editorial statement follows an open letter that several workers at Prism drafted and then published several weeks ago. That letter was a worker-led effort to make it as accessible as possible for other media workers to sign on and join. And the coverage that we've done since, including that opinion column, is reflective of the need that we recognize to be honest about what is happening in Palestine right now, and to counter so much of, like you said, the unwillingness to face that reality.
Why do you think it is that so many other news outlets are, in your words, evading their responsibility or failing to call this genocide?
I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that we live in a settler colony ourselves in the United States, and the propaganda that has built and maintained our country shapes how we think about the actions of other settler colonies, such as Israel. A lot of it comes down to how we're taught to think about violence and what we're taught to even consider violence, because violence that is enacted to uphold a settler colony or state is either seen as necessary or is not even considered violence at all because of its supposed necessity. And we've seen a lot of that rhetoric in the defense of Israel in the past couple of weeks, in the context of the importance of Jewish safety, the importance of Jews' right to self-determination. And a lot of that comes down to living in an imperialist hegemony ourselves, but also the very intentional work that has been done by certain Jewish organizations to link critiques of Zionism, critiques of Israel, to anti-Semitism. There's a line of logic there that on its surface can seem compelling, especially because Jewish people do deserve to be safe, and they have faced horrendous atrocities throughout history. We have seen a horrific rise in anti-Semitism in recent years, those are very real facts and a very real context for why some Jewish people do see a need for a state like Israel. But as many people have pointed out, the safety of Jewish people in Israel is already troubled by the mistreatment of Jews of color in Israel. It's troubled by what is done in the name of that safety, because it calls into question safety for whom? The, the safety of Jews in Israel, and particularly white European and American Jews in Israel, should not and cannot come at the cost of the safety of Palestinians, of the safety of Jews of color. And when it does, when genocide and displacement and ethnic cleansing are seen as necessary for safety, I think it's our responsibility to, at the very least, question that, and at the very least, be honest about what is happening. Be honest about the fact that this is violence too.
I'm speaking with Kim Rooney, an editor with Prism, an independent nonprofit news outlet led by journalists of color that report from the ground up and at the intersections of injustice. We're talking about the most recent opinion editorial from that collective, which talks about the fact that U.S. media companies are failing in their responsibility to report the genocide that is currently happening in Palestine. And I have to tell you, Kim, I am over here clutching my pearls. You used the word settler colony. I heard you say imperialism. Then you started talking about the treatment of Jews. And I'm just like, oh, over here, oh my goodness. Oh my Lord. Oh my God. I wanted to ask you, and you just covered so much of it in that last statement that you made, but I remember when Donald Trump first ascended to the US presidency, and there were, I remember as I, would consume media, as I would particularly consume news media, not just social media, but the news media, there just seemed to be so much, I guess, for lack of a better word, pearl clutching and consternation amongst journalists because they just really had a serious problem with, like, can we really say that the president is a liar? I mean, it really just seemed like there were serious debates going on that how do we say that how do we call out the how do we say he's lying? And I'm just sitting over in the corner like, you just say it, he's a liar. What is the problem? So this culture of, I'm not even sure what do you call it. Is it media respectability politics? What is this madness? What is it? Perhaps you can help. Perhaps you can help me and our audience understand what this madness is about.
I think a lot of it is rooted in respectability, but I think a lot of it too is rooted in the idea of liberal free speech and the supposed American value of protecting that. Of course, a lot of people's free speech has been chilled or dampened, as we've seen in the past couple of weeks, as pro-Palestinian organizers and supporters have been doxxed, have been threatened, have had their jobs rescinded, job offers rescinded. But I do think a lot of the reticence and hesitancy in being honest about what is happening, what we're seeing, is, I think a lot of the reticence and hesitancy is rooted in just the normalization of certain forms of authority. And I mean, in the United States, from grade school, we're taught that the president is the top official of the United States. And when you grow up surrounded by people, institutions, organizations, reinforcing that authority and that power structure, it's very difficult to, one, have that just completely undermined by the reality of a president lying, because that seems so incongruous with how we're taught to think about presidents' actions. But then also it's so difficult then not just to accept it, but then to say it and say it on a public platform, because it feels like a risk. It feels like all my life I've been hearing that the president can't lie. So if I say that he's lying, what will happen to me? Is
Well,
that something?
but that sounds. I mean, okay, I can hear that. I can hear you on that in terms of
Mhm.
regular, everyday people. But I thought the press was the fifth estate. I thought the press was the check on power. I thought that journalists were truth tellers. That's what I thought. I learned that too.
In an ideal world, yes, and I think that a lot of us still strive to be that, but we do still live in a capitalist system. And so there are material pressures to conform to power structures, to not stand against them, because ultimately employment is tied to healthcare. It's tied to your ability to pay for your housing, pay for your food, water, electricity, things like that. And I don't think that that negates the importance of telling the truth. I think that that is definitely an additional consideration. But ultimately, we do have a responsibility and an ethic in our field, like you said, to tell the truth and to be that fifth estate and to be willing and able to hold institutions and people in positions of power to account.
Hmm. Let's go back to your initial statement where you called Israel a settler colony.
Mhm.
Now, I'm sure the KPFK audience, I'm sure our audience is well aware what a settler colony is. But for those one or two people who have absolutely no clue, it's our job as journalists to make things clear. Please let that one or two let those one or two people know what it is you mean when you say settler colonial.
Right. So a settler colony is when people from another region, maybe multiple other regions, come to an area and establish a colony, establish a state. And so that's why when people say the United States is a settler colony, we're talking about displacing and frankly genociding indigenous people. And when we talk about Israel as a settler colony, we're talking about Jewish people, largely European and American Jewish people, coming to Palestine and displacing and destroying the homes of Palestinians.
As you know,
Mhm.
most recently, one of the scandals within this current crisis of genocide we are seeing had to do with the reporting of beheaded babies that ran through the media like wildfire. And the reporting to correct that has yet to catch up with that initial lie that ran through the media. We've also heard about, of course, students who have been doxxed, who have lost job offers. Most recently, President Biden has requested that the Department of Homeland Security increase its surveillance, that's the word I'll be using, on
Mhm.
college campuses because of not only an increase in anti Semitic activity, but the concern that there will be more because of what is happening right now in Gaza, in Palestine. To your knowledge, have any journalists here in the U.S. suffered any repercussions because of their reportage? Have you and the other folks at Prism suffered any repercussions for your editorial stance?
As an organization, to my knowledge, we have not suffered any repercussions. I've had very difficult conversations personally because of things that I have reposted from Prism, but as an organization, I don't believe so.
Okay, well, that's good to know.
I will say also that, so I'm a fact checker and copy editor, and I do think that so much of what consumes me every day is that reality, like you mentioned, that news corrections, factual corrections, never spread as far as the initial headlines. And especially at a time like this, I think it's vital that journalists, writers, editors, fact checkers, all media workers involved in the publication and dissemination of news are not just doing their due diligence, but being exceptionally careful, exceptionally thoughtful of what they're publishing and how they are framing what they're publishing right now.
So many of our Palestinian colleagues are literally placing their lives on the line right now to report from Gaza. I'm sure you have seen some of the horrific footage of journalists as well as doctors and others who have lost their loved ones minutes after being on camera. Saw a video of a doctor in a hospital who walked into a room and saw his loved ones who had been a victim of bombings. I've seen videos of journalists who, minutes after reporting, were informed of the deaths of their loved ones. In terms of support for other journalists, support for our colleagues, can you tell our audience, we know that there's I've seen several letters being circulated and I've signed a couple of them. Can you tell our audience, to your knowledge, what else can be done to support journalists, our colleagues who are attempting to report truthfully on this massacre, on this genocide?
I think one of the biggest things that can be done to support journalists right now is letting them know that they're doing right by their coverage, letting them know that what they're doing is necessary. And if they do face repercussions at their job, emailing their editors, email their supervisors, and let them know that this person should not be punished for reporting the truth. This person should not be punished for pushing back against the dehumanization of Palestinians. And for Palestinian journalists on the ground, I think one of the best things that we can do is continue calling for a ceasefire so that their lives are not in constant danger of carpet bombing, and the lives of their families and their friends, their community members, are not continuously endangered by Israeli carpet bombing.
For our listeners who want more information on the work that Prism does and wants to follow the types of stories that you all report, how can they get that information?
The best way that people can stay up to date with Prism's reporting is to follow us on social media. So we're at Prism Reports on Instagram and X/Twitter. People can also subscribe to our newsletter, where we'll send out regular updates about our coverage. And if they would like to support us directly, we're also doing our end of year giving campaign at the moment. So if people would like to support the writers and editors who are putting out this coverage, they can do so directly and materially through that.
And that's Prism Reports. That's the @ symbol PRISM Reports.
Mm-hmm.
Kimberly Rooney from Prism, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your truth telling. And thank you so much for being on Rootwork today.
Thank you so much for having me.